welcome to another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. This is your host, Michael Cross here, and tonight we're going to do something a little bit different than usual, and what I mean by that is that I had an interview on a radio show recently, and we're going to go ahead and play that during the time period that I normally do this program. And, well, before I start, it's on Psychopaths. I've put a couple articles on my website at michaelcross.net on this subject, as well as several other subjects dealing with society in general. And so just go to michaelcross.net or check out my YouTube station at, Michael Cross. And anyway, the show that is coming up here is the Richie Allen show that comes out of England. Superb interviewer, and had a lot of fun in putting this all together. And essentially, what the main thrust is trying to find out exactly what constitutes psychopathic behavior, and then essentially some of the questions that surround that, such as societal control. Why is it, for instance, that psychopaths seem to do so well when it comes to climbing the corporate ladder or in their given professions? How come the light always shines on them? And what are the characteristics that seem to assist that? Now, in fairness, I point out that not all psychopaths are evil. Okay, we've interviewed people dealing with this on this show, and the thing is, psychopathy refers to a way that someone looks at life, perhaps through a hyper-cognitive way of judging events and judging circumstances, maybe using a little bit less emotion or a lot less emotion, or sometimes even no emotion. And the thing is that I've pointed out numerous times, and I think a few people, at least in the comments section when we were doing the show, that a few people really mistake this for, in some ways, trying to make it sound as if, psychopaths are like a cool group of people. And I never say that. The thing is, what I point out is that I'm going to liken a psychopath to a Terminator from the series Terminator. And essentially, in the first Terminator movie, which was excellent, the Terminator was devoid of emotion and had a purpose. And that purpose was that he was going to kill Sarah Connor and prevent her from giving birth, kind of like a really early abortion in that sense, before she's even pregnant, and prevent her son from someday leading the resistance against the robots. Now, the second Terminator, it was essentially the same model. It was a Terminator, and it had a slightly different program to protect the son of this woman so that he could grow up and lead the rebellion against the robots. Now, in both cases, you had a psychopathic robot. But in one, the mission was to kill, and in the other one, it was to protect. And essentially, I know some people like to liken psychopaths to reptiles. And the thing is that in the reptile world, you take a look at, you try and mess with an alligator or crocodile's young until they reach, of course, a certain age. And that creature will go after you with everything it's got, or any other creature that tries to mess with them. You see, I think all animals actually have some sort of sense of maternity, or at least most of at least the higher organisms. And the thing is, can we say it's empathy? I don't know. In humans, we expect it to be empathy. We expect a human being to feel empathy, to feel guilt, to feel remorse and not to analyze everything and come out with like a cost-benefit spreadsheet when it comes to basic morality and treatment of others. But there are people, psychopaths, who really lack that sense of empathy. They lack a sense of guilt. They are prone to boredom. They have a glorified sense of themselves as if they're the center of the universe. They have often a sense of wanting to have what's known as narcissistic supply, which means, most psychopaths don't lock themselves up in the corner like they're depicted on detective series and, never venture out unless it's to go prey on society. Most of them like attention. Most of them like the limelight because, I think everyone likes a little attention. But what if your personality required it? In a sense, like a vampire needs blood. Your personality desired to be able to take this. Now, the thing is, there are psychopaths who maybe they go into acting. Maybe they're your favorite actress is ultimately a psychopath, or a singer, or any number of other people, and maybe some CEO, and maybe your favorite politician. But ultimately, you have to make the determination: what ethics do they follow? And do they have a good track record of following those ethics? I guess the way I look at it is I look at almost all politicians as being psychopaths. Now, I know deep down that they're not. Not all of them are, although I do suspect that they score much higher on for instance, the hair checklist than the average person would. But the thing is that if I see that they have a track record where they follow what they say they follow, then I'm likely to say I'll support this person, regardless of their psychopathy, or even in some cases a narcissist. There's some politicians I look at and say that's not a psychopath, that's a narcissist. Even though in some ways a narcissist is more dangerous than a psychopath, at least at the political level. But the thing is that, do we really have a lot of people who would score 5 or 6? And you just look it up. Look up the hair checklist of psychopathy. And ask yourself, would a person that scores a 5 or a 6 be able to make it in today's predatory political society? They may, I think the higher you go in politics, and I'm just going to center on politics, the more the psychopath is going to come out on top. You see, each level we go through, let's say you start out at the city council and then go on to be, a county commissioner. And then you go on maybe to be a state representative. And, someday you become a congressman. The thing is, each stage you went through is like going through a tournament on the Hunger Games. When you first start out, maybe the people you're going up against, at the city level are somewhat amateuristic. Okay, a lot of these people are motivated by some specific issue like the zoning on their street or something else that's really inconsequential in the long run. But ultimately, it's an easier fight to make it. But then as you go on, it's the prize is a little bit better. Maybe as a city councilman, you don't get any money, but as a county commissioner, you do. And then, of course, if you want some real power, get into the state legislature. You get money, and there's more power because the power is more concentrated. And then if you want to go into national politics, well, you've got your experience as a state legislature, so then you go on to the next round. So it's essentially each round is a Hunger Games competition, or something akin to the Roman Colosseums. And since it is that way, you can expect these kinds of people come up on top. So ultimately, what I try in the interview that follows is to present the reasons why we need to keep an eye on politicians, but at the same time, why I think ultimately we're kind of destined to wind up with a lot of psychopathic people or people that have very similar traits to the psychopath gain in office. But but the ones that have no ethics, they're a dangerous breed. Remember, Terminator, first movie. You'd much rather have Terminator, second and third movie. Okay? The thing is that ultimately you've got to keep an eye on them. And remember, like, oh gosh, who said this? George Washington? I don't remember. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. May have been Thomas Jefferson. I think it was Thomas Jefferson. But ultimately, founding fathers realized that, power is attractive to people, and you have to balance those powers, and you can't just sit back and think someone else is going to, because as Plato said, if you leave politics up to someone else, that someone else is going to exercise power at your expense, ultimately. Anyway, hope you enjoy the interview. Take care. Bye now.
He's a psychologist. He's also an author, and he hosts the Unlock the Door radio show. We'll find out more about that in the next 40 minutes or thereabouts. And we're going to be talking, as I said, about psychopaths, but also much more besides. Check out his website. It's a fascinating website. It's michaelcross.net. That's michaelcross.net. He's very well known to a lot of people in the independent media. It's my first time chatting to him. I can't wait to do that. So let's welcome Michael Cross to the show. Michael, how are you?
Hey, very good. How are you doing, Richie?
I'm really well, and thanks very much for reaching out to me. I'm honoured that you did, because like I said, you've done a lot of really terrific stuff yourself, and as I said, you're well known in the independent media. So thanks for getting in touch, Michael, and your work is fascinating, and I can't wait to talk about it. Are you in Sweden right now?
Yeah, I'm an American, but I live in Sweden.
Right, so it's getting on there. It's getting kind of late. I was trying to figure out what time zone would you be in, but you're in Sweden, beautiful part of the world, Sweden, of course. And it really is great to chat with you. You've put some fabulous, interesting, insightful and thought-provoking articles on your site in the last few weeks about artificial intelligence, about psychopaths, and about consumerism. And I suppose we'll get into bits and pieces in the next 45 minutes or so. But I'll tell you what, Michael, you whetted even my appetite when you emailed me and you talked about psychopaths, what it means, how we came to define it, and what it really is. It's absolutely fascinating. What's a psychopath? What is it?
Well, a psychopath is generally, just to put it simply, it's a personality disorder, which basically means it's not a mental illness, despite what you might see in Hollywood, the way they might present someone in a crime drama as being a psychopath. It's not a mental illness. It's just that people that have certain traits that have been identified by psychologists such as Checkley back in the 40s, Robert Hare more recently, traits that put them kind of at the far end of the spectrum in the way that they see life and how their personality is set up. So, generally speaking, there's a criteria, a test that psychologists and criminologists and so forth will administer to people to see how far they score on this psychopathic checklist. And if they score at a certain level, depending on which country you're in, Britain has a different standard than Canada and America and so forth, then they'd be classified as psychopaths. But the one thing
you've seen the test, Michael.
Huh?
You've seen these tests or these assessments.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. Give us an idea of the sort of questions that would be on a test or a questionnaire like that.
Okay, well, just to summarize them to a certain degree, you would have tests that would, first of all, they'd ask the question, is this a trait that defines you? Okay, before I go into the traits. Is this a trait that is just, well, that, is that Richie or is that Mike? If you're given the question. And then there's the rating where you might say, well, that seems to be the way I am a lot, but I don't really define myself that way. I just seem to be more that way than others. And then, of course, there's the, well, that really does not describe me. I may do this once in a while, but not very often. And so just simply, you might score a 0 if you had the latter, and then a 1 if it's a lot of times, and if it's just you in a nutshell, then that could be a 2. Now, of course, if you take these kinds of tests on the internet, which there are out there, don't go to Facebook and those kinds of tests.
Yeah.
What's your favorite color and what's your favorite band for a psychopathic test. People have put lots of stuff out there. But you can find the questions fairly easy if you also include Checkley or Hare's name in your search. But anyway, I'll give you a couple of the questions. I mean, it could be, do you have glib and superficial charm? Meaning it's something that you could turn on and turn off depending on the situation. You might go to a party if you're a psychopath, and you may have no interest in those people whatsoever, and then someone says, oh, by the way, that person over there is the CEO of the company you're interested in applying for. And then you could go over and smooth talk him or her, and act like you're their best buddy.
Okay. Is that not ambition, though?
Well, the thing is, though, yes, a lot of these traits may sound like ambition.
Yeah.
We get into the idea that this is the way you are. And other things fit into this, too. So it's not just if you're just charming. Yeah. I mean, there's people that are charming that are far from being psychopathic. But there's the other traits that cluster in it. And that's, for instance, you get things like grandiose self-worth. Often in America, you get politicians that when they're running for president, they'll come out that, well, he wanted to be president since he was 6 years old. Those
yeah. Who wants to be president? Yeah, from the time they're 6. But I'm sure some have.
Yeah.
Some people have had those ideas.
Oh, of course. And also you may feel like you're kind of the center of the universe, which can be actually an advantage in some ways, because if you walk into, like I said, the hypothetical party, and you just sit in the corner, well, then you're not going to get noticed. But if all of a sudden you know how to get the attention around you, well, that attracts people saying, well, he seems to be ambitious. Maybe women are like, wow, this guy is, he seems to have something going for him. And, of course, that's very attractive to the opposite sex. And then you get into such things as they tend to be very susceptible to boredom. They don't like the mundane. They don't like doing the same thing over and over. And it might be because of serotonin levels in their brain. That's been speculation. No one really knows for sure.
Yeah.
But something that might excite you or 95% of the rest of the population may take a little bit more for them to get excited. So this could explain, for instance, why it seems so many members of the British Parliament and U.S. Congress and even former presidents, you think, well, people are watching them, but yet they're involved in these horrendous sex scandals. Well, it's really not that they were just being clumsy. It's because it's a thrill for a lot of politicians, because politicians are more, they're more likely to be psychopath. I'm not saying the majority, but they're more likely to have the traits.
Can you add into that? Because this is really interesting now. Can you also add to that then the previous trait you mentioned, that grandiose self-worth idea, that I'm really, really important? Does that factor into the tendency to do nasty things to children and to other men and women because of the fact that you can, or because of the fact that they think, well, I can do whatever I want because of who I am?
Yeah, you can get entitlement. Of course, you can get entitlement with people that aren't psychopathic, but with psychopaths, there's a certain sense of narcissism. I interviewed one guy that was an expert on my radio show, and he said that, for instance, when it comes to sexuality and relationships, the psychopath, it's not so much that they're making love with their partner, is that they are treating their partner to themselves.
Right.
So they have sort of this sense that they're sort of like a gift to mankind. And when you have that kind of entitlement feeling, then it can lead to really manipulating people and hurting people, because ultimately you don't see your actions as being in the same realm as just the way the average person is. I'll say this one thing. They tend to not conform to societal norms, which actually can lead sometimes to heroic behavior. They may do things that we later say, wow, this politician or just this guy that ran out in the street and saved this lady from a burning car. Very heroic, but at the same time, when everyone else is just standing around doing nothing, it could be that they have high levels of psychopathy because they're like, hey, I don't care. I'm just going to go out there and do it. Or it could be for the reward, like, way, now I'm going to get in the newspaper for doing this. Yeah. But nevertheless, that's one of the things that tends to complicate the issue, because sometimes on alternative media we talk about, oh, they're evil, they're in politics, they're CEOs of corporations, they're this, and this. But in some respects, then when you look at the checklist for which presidents of the United States, for instance, rate high in psychopathy, you find some of the ones that are the most popular, like JFK and Ronald Reagan. You're like, well, no, they were nice. Well, it didn't mean they had to be evil. It just meant that they were very driven, and they may have scored very high when psychologists and historians will look at these traits. Of course.
Now, Michael, this is where we get to the definition of psychopaths that most of us, and I include me, I don't include you because you're obviously you've looked into this and you've researched and read and written so much about it. But this is where some of our listeners now, they'll say, oh, Jesus, Michael has mentioned JFK. JFK was a good guy. What Michael is saying is, and it's important, the definition that we have of a psychopath, if I was to get 100 listeners and say psychopath, they might think Jeffrey Dahmer, they might think Hannibal Lecter, or any other serial killer that you can think of. That's what we think of, Michael, because that's what the media tells us a psychopath is. But what you're saying is, as disturbing and as maybe, not normal these traits are, you can be a psychopath and not cause anybody any physical harm. You can live your life with this condition and not be a danger to society.
Oh, absolutely. It's just that you could, an apology to dog lovers out there that may own these dogs, but it's like a Rottweiler. A Rottweiler can be the most gentle dog ever, but if under the right situations, it can be extremely vicious. And I think psychopaths can fall into that same category that, they can be, like in politics, they're very Machiavellian. If getting your way by being nice will get your way, then you do it. If you have to crack a few eggs to do it, then, as Lenin would say, you have to do that too. But there is the aspect of fearless dominance. And, you mentioned Hannibal Lecter. And everyone can oh yeah, the psychopath's he's a medical doctor, but he eats people. Another fictional character that falls under psychopathy would be James Bond. And, most people are like, well, no, he's the good guy. Yeah, but take a look at his traits. If you especially look at the older James Bond films, when he kills people in very hideous ways.
Because he's government told him to, and he doesn't question the orders, or is it right to do that to that person? Do they have a family? Yeah.
But he also,
I understand that, Michael, yeah.
But especially when Sean Connery was the James Bond, he'd always have this little glib joke, when he, pushed the button that blew up the place. It was like, he'd have some joke about, well, or he's killed someone, and the girl says, well, where is he? Well, he kind of fell apart.
That's right, and we saw that in the 1980s thrillers with Schwarzenegger and Stallone. They always had a funny gag after they tossed somebody off a cliff or something.
Yeah.
I had to let him go and all of that sort of stuff.
And that is where you may have the fearless dominance that sometimes you get the anti-hero. It's like the character in my book series. I do a fictional book series. The fourth one's coming out here very soon, the Freedom from Conscience series. And in it, it's a female psychopath, but she's the hero. It's just you get a sense of how she thinks because it's a narrative. Very similar, I guess the closest thing I can come to that is like when, Clockwork Orange, you're seeing the world through Alex's eyes. Yeah. And in this one, you see the world through Melanie's eyes. And the thing is that I've had people that have read the book and say, hey, is there something wrong with me? I actually totally fell in love with this character. I had a girl actually say, gosh, I'm not a lesbian, but if I met her, I'd date her. And I'm saying, well, this is the way psychopathy works.
Do you know what? I can't. This is the truth. I never tell lies. I'm not going to say I've read the Freedom from Conscience series. I haven't. But watching you coming on the program, Michael's books have been really, really well reviewed, and you can find links to them on michaelcross.net. And this character that you write about does sound absolutely fascinating. I want to just briefly pause because I've had quite a few emails and tweets, Michael, so I just want to read a couple of them out.
Okay.
Because this is fascinating, people. And of course, we're going to get to the big question now in a minute, which is how are people with psychopathic tendencies or traits getting to the top positions in the important jobs, whether it be politics or whether it be industry. We will, of course, talk to Michael about that and what it means for the rest of us. We'll get to that in a second. Karen was on to say, Michael said something very interesting, which is that the tests are different in every country. How is that, Michael? Can you explain why? Surely people are people, irrespective of where they come from.
Well, in a lot of psychology, even though we have the DSM, which is kind of vague, I mean, they have antisocial personality disorder, and there's some psychologists that feel that psychopathy should be the way we see personality, whereas there's others that say it has to have a behavioral component. So I fall into that category that says that it should be seen as a personality. In other words, many psychopaths have never broken the law. But yet there is this tendency to think, well, no, they should, one of the criteria for antisocial personality disorder is that they, get in trouble. Well, it's not necessarily the case. I think another fictional example, if I could think of it, House of Cards.
Right, the Kevin Spacey thing. Yeah.
He fits it too. That same kind of Machiavellian, I'm going to go for my goal and so forth. But now here's the thing, just like with, if you go to one country like France, for instance, they don't see ADHD as being something that really is a disorder. They see it as more of you've got some behaviors we need to modify. Whereas,
do you think it's a disorder, Mike?
Huh?
Do you think ADHD is a genuine disorder? Because I've got very serious doubts about the way Big Pharma invent illnesses to sell medication for. I mean, we all knew children in school that were daydreamers and didn't really pay attention, but giving them drugs is something I've got a problem with. But we don't need to get into that. But do you think it's a real disorder?
Personally, not the way that it's defined. I think it would be like saying that a person with red hair and blue eyes has a disorder because they're more susceptible to catching skin cancer if they're in the sun. I mean, it's a skin tone, it runs the spectrum. You get people that are very, very light. Someone with red hair in Ireland is going to be more susceptible to getting skin cancer than someone who's black and lives in Nigeria.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean the redhead has a disorder. It just means that they're different. And I think that's the way with ADHD too. But in America, oh my gosh, some little boy throws a piece of paper at someone trying to get their attention, and all of a sudden he's down in the counselor's office and getting a medical referral, and some doctor that has 60 patients that day is just like...
Do you know what's tragic, Michael? Do you know what's tragic? These days they're getting arrested. We've seen examples of them being handcuffed. And I tell you what, Michael, you will not be surprised by this. I'm loving this chat. It's really great to have Michael Cross on the program. I've had only a dozen emails asking you about behaviours within police officers and policemen and women. And if you want to get into that in a minute, you can. But let me read out a couple of more tweets. JP asks, haven't we all got traits? And you can answer that in a second if you want. It's a good question. Philip was on to say, what's the difference between a psychopath and somebody with an antisocial personality disorder? So those are two questions. And Karen, how are you, Karen? Are these tendencies hereditary? Which is a brilliant question. Michael, we really could have done a longer show than this. There's so much coming in.
I can come back later.
Of course you can come back. We'll definitely have you back. This is marvellous. Now, Philip says, what's the difference between a psychopath and an antisocial personality disorder?
Well, it's kind of like what I said. It's more of a definition. Yeah. One is looking more at behaviors. The other one's looking more at a personality itself. So I guess one is the way you look at the world, would be more psychopathic, and also it's seen more in the sense of it being related to genetics. There's been a big controversy. over the issue of what's a sociopath, for instance, and a psychopath. And ultimately, when you get right down to it, I've interviewed psychologists on this on my radio show, and the consensus is there's really no such thing as a sociopath. It is a psychopath. It's just that during the days of B.F. Skinner, when it was very politically incorrect to say someone was born with a trait, they came up with the idea of sociopaths, meaning that you became this way because of your environment. I personally believe that it is a combination of environment and genetics, but the environment will cause you to express the trait differently. For instance, I talked to James Fallon. You ever hear of him? Not the comedian, but the neurosurgeon.
No, I haven't. I can't say I have one.
Okay, he's a professor in neurology, and I can't remember which California university, but he was doing brain scans of serial killers. And there was also a test being done on Alzheimer's. And so he volunteered his family and himself to get brain scans so they could be like control subjects, so they could be for the Alzheimer's. And he was looking through the brain scans, and he found one brain scan that he was like, no, this is one of my serial killers. This is not my, one of the controls. And then he found out that, no, that was his brain.
It was his own brain.
And
it was very similar to the serial killer. That's incredible.
Yeah, and then he told me that what happened was if you check my YouTube station, the interview's there. And he went to his friends, colleagues, people that had known him all of his life, his family, and said, "Can you believe?
Am I okay?"
They said I'm a psychopath, and they're going, the indication he gave was kind of like, yeah. They were like, yeah, I can see that. And, there's probably people out there right now who may be listening that are like, oh yeah, psychopaths. And then they take the test and they're like, oh my gosh, I scored a 25 on this. What am I doing?
So that goes back to JP's question asking, do we all have one or more traits associated with psychopathy, do we?
Yeah, we do, but I've administered this to students, for years, and the average is like, on these tests, the good ones, you'll get, and of course you can't really do this in a testing situation. I mean, the people that are experts in this will then go through a battery of additional tests and see how those cluster in the different realms, but usually most people get about a 4 or a 5 when they're taking the test, because there's a couple of the traits, maybe, they kind of feel that they've always thought of themselves like a princess or something, and so they'll score a 2 on the grandiose thing, but then the rest of them, no, I'm nice, I have empathy. That's a big trait there. That's a big defining trait. Psychopaths can have sympathy, but not empathy, usually.
Of course, there's a massive difference. A lot of people don't understand. There's a massive difference. Gotta say this before I mention some more comments. I had a difficult time as a kid and went through a series of counsellors that weren't any good, and met a counsellor called Tony, who was magnificent. He was a great guy. Challenged me, Michael, gave me a right good beating, to face up to the things that had happened to me. He was a lovely guy, Tony. And for a long time I kept in touch with Tony, And as a proper clinician or physician, privacy, of course, and ethics were sacrosanct to him, and he would never tell any stories about anybody particularly. But he did say something that scared me. He said, Richie, I'll tell you what, he said, I see a lot of sociopaths. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, of course, I'm not going to do him any justice now by explaining this properly, but he said to me, Richie, I meet a lot of people who genuinely believe that and you touched on this earlier, Michael, that they are the only person in the world, and that everybody else is not really real. And that scared the bejesus out of me, Michael. And I said, seriously, Tony? And he said, yeah, I meet a lot of people who admit to wondering a lot, are they the only person in the world? And is everybody else a mirage or, something different? And I thought, that's not a healthy way to be thinking, really. And he said, yeah, but I see a lot of that. And of course, he didn't elaborate much on it. Does that make any sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. Now, I have no proof whatsoever about Edward Bernays. He was the he was the nephew, for listeners don't know, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who, when he found out what Sigmund Freud, his uncle, had written about how the human brain works on the subconscious level, he decided, hey, I can make money off this. And, of course, he became the father of advertising in the 20th century and, again, in the 21st century. But the thing is, I've read about him where basically he didn't do so well one-on-one with people, but groups. He saw people as groups. And that gave him an ability to be an incredible marketer. He knew how to sell a concept to 1 million people. He could twist them around, get them doing, he's like the founder of much of what we eat for breakfast, because he was working with companies that were like, well, how do we get people to eat more eggs or bacon or something like that for breakfast?
Right.
And he knew how to do it. He worked with companies that meant fantastic campaign to get women to smoke, and sold it on the idea of feminism. Ultimately, torches of freedom.
And it worked.
Yeah, and it did work. And I can't help but think he would have to score high on the psychopathy. I mean, I don't know, but I would speculate that he would, because this is the way a psychopath would see the world. This is goals. It's the same way, especially in U.S. politics, when a senator or a candidate for U.S. president, if he can get up there, or she, note that, can get up in front of an audience, and they see the audience as more of a validation for themselves. They don't see the audience as, well, this is 1,000 people from this community, and I'm trying to relate to them. They see this as 1,000, I forget the term. Basically stroking their ego when they're up there on stage.
They're not seeing individual men, women, and children with individual personalities. They're not.
No,
right.
In fact, a lot of politicians probably use a technique of looking over slightly your audience to make it look like you're looking at them in the eye, but instead you're avoiding eye contact because you're thinking about what to say.
Michael, they play that game where they pretend they've recognized somebody in the audience, don't they? Well, how significant is that when they look over and they wink at somebody?
Yeah.
And it's actually nobody.
Yep.
They're not looking at anybody.
Or it's a situation where it's a plant. I mean, that's been found so many times where, they'll pick someone in the audience and ask them a question, and then later it's found out that they're working for their campaign, It's these campaign events are staged so much.
They use rent a crowd, and we've seen that recently with Jeb Bush and with Trump. And others, they even hire people in to stand there and scream like idiots while they're basically telling lies.
Well, I don't know if anyone's actually supporting Jeb Bush in the United States. He might have to rent a vote or something. I have not met one person, and anywhere, even on Facebook, who hey, I like Jeb Bush. They're nowhere. I don't know where these polls.
He's doing a wonderful job of appearing more ignorant on world affairs than his older brother, which. You never would have you wouldn't have put a dime with a bookmaker on Jeb Bush looking more ridiculous than George W. Bush. Tell you what we're going to do. It's 26 minutes to the top of the area with the Richie Allen Show going out around the world on Talk Radio Europe, Fab Radio International, of course, DavidIke.com, RichieAllenShow.com, and Neon Nettle. I've got to mention those as well. Michael Cross is going to stay with me for another 20 minutes. He's terrific. Check out michaelcross.net. When we come back after a very, very brief 90-second pause, we're going to ask about the prevalence, the positioning of psychopaths in the important positions in the world and what it means for us. Michael, stay with us. 90 seconds. If you want to grab yourself a little sip of water there, we'll be right back. It's brilliant to have him on. 90 seconds. Welcome back to the programme. Without further ado, let's get Michael straight back on. Michael, what was that Twitter handle you gave me? I think you said @PsychoGovMike. Is that right?
Oh, I made a mistake there because I've just started using Twitter. It's PsychoMike777.
PsychoMike777. That's Michael on Twitter. I'll tweet that out there again. He needs to start using it more. I never liked it, Michael, but I'm starting to appreciate it because listeners can get instant comments. They can give you instant feedback. It's much, much quicker and much better than email. But I obviously bemoan the fact that you've only got 140 characters, whatever it is. But anyway, it's really good. Good evening, Laura LaRue in California. Nice to know you're listening, Laura. Paul was on to say, people in charge of this planet spend money looking for life on other planets, yet they spend more on killing life on this one as well. This brings us now neatly to, are we being led, governed, are we working for, in our jobs, in our factories, in our offices, our politicians, are we surrounded by leaders and powerful people? Are we surrounded by psychopaths, effectively?
I would hesitate to start thinking we're surrounded by them, but I will say that it is an advantage when it comes to leadership. Because ultimately, this is one thing I always point out to students, the definition of leadership and manipulation is essentially the same. It's to get someone to do something they wouldn't normally do on their own. If I say eat breakfast and they were going to eat breakfast anyway, I'm not a leader. If I say I want you to eat a certain type of cereal and I can persuade them, then I've led them. So, of course, I'm a leader, but I can manipulate them into wanting to eat the cereal. So leaders, higher up you go, the more likely you're going to get these kinds of these people show up, because the traits I've just mentioned, for instance, think about this. There's a lot of guys that have trouble getting dates, and they take these courses in like neuro-linguistic programming. I forget what they call it, but it has something to do with getting dates. But and they'll train them essentially on a lot of the traits they train them on is how to be more psychopathic, how to walk into a room and pretend like you're like the most important person in the room, how to talk to someone and try to manipulate their feelings and these kinds of things. Psychopaths do this naturally. And they don't even know that they're doing it sometimes. But in a political sense, we live in a media-driven political world where you say, it's the sound bite. You give the clever sound bite. Like, I'm not accusing him, but, Donald Trump, when he made the comment about, I'd rather be a patriot than be politically correct or something like that.
Yeah.
And no one remembers the rest of the debate. No one actually remembers anything from that Republican debate except for Donald Trump versus Megyn Kelly.
That's right, the Trump-isms. That's all people remember. That's right, a few handful stock statements by Trump. You're absolutely 100%. If I was to think, and I watched it on YouTube, I didn't watch it live, I watched it on YouTube, I can only remember some of the things he said that you've just mentioned there. That's right.
But the one thing I remember that he actually came across really well on was when he was starting to talk about how much money he'd given to both Republicans and Democrats, and that the political system was corrupt. And some of the people on the stage were like, hey, if you want to send me some money. He just said how corrupt the system was, and then he gets people going, hey, send me some money. It's like, you just proved the point.
And that's an obsession with the self that's truly amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
That your instinct is to say, send me some money then, and you mean it. It wasn't a joke, I saw that. They actually meant it.
Yeah, and the thing is that the way it's set up, though, I mean, the way our system's set up, you've got to be charming people that have lots of money, because you're not going to make it on getting $3 and $4 contributions in the United States.
No,
you're not going to make it even to the state legislature. You've got to get big money interest backing you. And that means essentially, how uncomfortable, a lot of people find it uncomfortable to go to a job interview. Think about going to not just a job interview, but begging for money over and over and over in the course of a day.
Imagine it, yeah.
Yeah, and you go to some big corporation, and they're asking what do we get out of this, and you've got to be able to tell them enough to they feel good about giving you money, and of course a person who's mild, soft spoken, those kinds of things, they're not going to be very good. They're not going to make it to the top. Whereas someone who's sharp and they're like, hey, I'm the center of the world, I deserve you to give me money so I can run and achieve my dreams, they're going to do it. They're going to have that self-confidence, just like in the relationship game. The guy who's really, in the movies, it's always the really nice best friend, but he never gets a girl. It's always the guy that has the charm and the really smooth personality. I mean, so.
But often sleazy. A number of people ask me, too many to read them all out individually. And this is coming in from, let me just scroll down there, because there's actually 2 or 3 people asked pretty much the same question. I have one from Don and one from Lisa. Lisa says she's listening in Manchester. How are you doing, Lisa? I might bump into you someday. A lot of listeners in Manchester because I'm based here. The question basically goes back to empathy. And a couple of people asked about the capacity for psychopaths to feel empathy. Now, you touched on this already. And I'll give you my own example on that. When we see somebody who's down on their luck, it affects us. When I say us, I mean my fiance and myself. It really bothers us. And it bothers me to the point where I lie awake thinking, how did we end up where men and women are not able to look after themselves and are lying in doorways? How did we end up like that? And how did we get there? And what could we possibly do about that? And I'm not a saint, and I'm certainly nobody's hero. I'm guessing that the true psychopath just couldn't give a crap and would never dwell or think about the homeless person unless there was a way to make money on them.
Yeah, or unless they were like what you would consider, it falls into the category cerebral psychopaths, like, for instance, Karl Marx. Aleister Crowley, I would say, was probably a cerebral psychopath. And those kinds of people, instead of thinking of the person who's laying in the gutter, they're the ones that can come up with all kinds of theories. They don't really see the person in the gutter, but they have a way of coming up with theories to explain it and maybe to capitalize on it. But it's more of a cognitive way of looking at life. I look at it, what was it? Stalin said the death of one is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. Very psychopathic, but again, it was looking at things more in a statistical way. So if I see someone begging in the street and I'm a psychopath, I might be thinking, how is this going to affect the businesses in my community if there's people begging there? I'm not going to be thinking...
We've seen that in Manchester here, where businesses were very quick to try and move homeless people on only because of the impact on their business. Nobody was concerned about whether they could give a sandwich to the men and women or a cup of coffee or ask them, do they need any medical help or anything like that. It was all about the business. We saw that here. It was a big story in this city in the last couple of weeks.
Well, at least people care there. I mean, if you go to the United States, and these are Democratic-controlled cities, in many cities in the United States, the cities have made it illegal to give food to homeless people.
That's right, yeah. How psychotic is that, Michael? Who dreams up that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, a lot of people, maybe the Democrats try to say, well, we're the party of the working people, but at the same time, they go to the same country clubs as the Republicans do. They have the same membership.
Indeed, they do.
Exclusive clubs, and they have the same business friends, and they're looking, they look at the street, they're not thinking of the poor people, they're thinking of they're wanting it to look nice and pretty, just like everyone else. And if there's homeless people, it's like sometimes when these countries host Olympic Games, what do? They bus all the homeless people out of the city.
Oh, they do. We've seen that. We've seen it in London. I saw it in Ireland many years ago when the Tour de France was in Ireland, the famous race. You'll know, of course. Maybe some of our listeners won't know. Famous bike race came through Waterford. They took a lot of the homeless lads, they put them in a van, gave them cheap vodka and took them miles away from the city. Mm-hmm. Gave them cheap vodka and dumped them. And left them there. A marvellous question from Martin Houston. We haven't even gotten into talking about police officers and whether or not psychopaths are being hired specifically because they're psychopaths to work in the police force.
Well,
but Martin, can I just say this, because this is a great question, Michael. Martin Houston says, what happens if two psychopaths meet? Is there a clash? How do they deal with one another? How do they get on with one another?
Well, I kind of deal with that in my books. Of course, in the first two books, it's more of a relationship between a psychopath and a borderline. But later, it gets into more like how would psychopaths interrelate to one another, even in a romantic sense. And the thing is that sometimes they can make it work. How do you say this? It's like maybe two people that can bask in each other's sunlight or sunshine, right, or that sort of thing. They can actually make it work. Now, often a psychopath will seek out someone. I've actually heard that often psychopaths and Asperger's get along well with each other because the psychopath uses them as kind of a minion. to get things done. Like at work, if you have an Asperger that knows all the stuff about a computer program, and the psychopath that really doesn't want to bother learning about the computer program, they're always like, hey, could you do this for me really quick? And they'll do it for them.
And they'll do it. Right.
Or in a relationship, often psychopaths will hook up with someone that's very nurturing. And, maybe that gets into that whole Freudian, seeking the opposite sex parent, maybe the mother figure. I don't know. But the thing about police forces, in America, there's actually been cases where police departments have said that someone with too high of IQ cannot become a member of the police force.
Do you remember that? That's right. Yeah. And again, this is proven fact. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
And one of the reasons that's been presented as to why they can get away with that is that maybe if someone's got too high of IQ and they're too educated, they may feel like they have a right to question a policy. So therefore, the police department wants people that will just, it used to be, protect and serve in the United States. That was the motto. Now it's law enforcement agent. That's how it's said. Well, there's a huge difference between those two things. I mean, a law enforcement agent is someone whose rule is to make sure you obey whatever law is in that society. No questions asked. And, if you've got someone who maybe, I've always said this, and I'm not saying this about all police officers, but I am saying that there is a tendency for some people who are highly intelligent psychopaths wind up becoming the people that make the laws, and people with not so high of intelligence who are psychopaths wind up enforcing the laws.
Enforcing them. And we've had a couple of emails, one from Karen about are psychopaths drawn to the military and the police. Lynn, how you doing, Lynn? Right. Lynn says that she's a Leo / Virgo, born on the cusp of Leo and Virgo. And she puts her own personality down to that. But could the Leo traits, she says, be classed as psychotic? Andrea came on to say, are the likes of Madonna and Lady Gaga superstar pop stars, do they have psychotic traits? There's so many questions coming in tweets, and we're not going to be able to get through all of these. Go on, go ahead.
I have no idea. I just have to say that Obama, Fidel Castro, Clinton, and myself are Leos. So
you're okay.
So was Napoleon, I believe. So who knows? But we could get into Carl Jung's psychology, and we could spend an hour on archetypes.
Yeah. But a lot of people have mentioned Tony Blair, of course. We obviously, those of us who have a little bit of courage in the media, we call him what he is. He's a war criminal. He should be in The Hague answering for the carnage that he wreaked or wrought even on the Iraqi people. Here's the guy who told lies to Parliament, knowing they were lies about the capability of Saddam Hussein and 45 minutes and all of that. I know, you're the educated man, Michael. This is your specialty. I'm not. But to me, genuine psychopath player surely must be.
He might be. I'm actually quite surprised he never got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, they usually give the Peace Prize to murderers. They do. Yeah.
The thing is, a lot of politicians, it would be interesting. You'd have to actually find out how they personally feel about things. I still remember Hillary Clinton when she was asked about Gaddafi when he was killed. How's Libya doing right now after America and Britain brought it democracy? The thing is, you can look on YouTube, type in Gaddafi, Hillary laughing. And she's asked the question, something about Gaddafi dying, and she starts kind of giggling. I'm like, what? When Hitler died, I don't think Roosevelt suddenly started giggling. When the Japanese were defeated, I don't think Truman started giggling. And I was like, whoa, this is different.
These are the alarm bells start ringing when you see somebody laughing at something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't even see, police chiefs or judges or wardens or whatever laughing about executing a criminal, like, they execute Ted Bundy. You didn't see him out there, joking around about it.
No, we saw people dancing in the streets, and obviously people who were affected by what Bundy did, we can maybe condone or maybe sympathise with it. But you're right, you don't see the warden who has to escort the man to the chamber. We don't see him finding it remotely amusing.
My other thing that got me kind of, the red flags coming up. Of course, you can't diagnose, but it was interesting when back in the 90s when Madeleine Albright was asked the question. They listed how many tens of thousands of Iraqi children had died because of the sanctions.
Because of the sanctions, yeah.
And she just said, well, if it advances our foreign policy objectives, this is this kind of disconnect with human suffering. Not even, I would say, at least when Jimmy Carter, he was a president, when he talks about human suffering, it looks like he genuinely actually empathizes, for whatever leadership abilities he had or didn't.
Yeah.
He seemed to empathize. You never saw Reagan dancing around when the wall came down or something. It wasn't, we beat you, or something like that.
Yeah, there was no triumphalism. And it's interesting you mentioned Albright, the former Secretary of State, and her attitude towards the results of the sanctions. And I've often wondered about the inability to think about and feel for those who are on the other end of your foreign policy. We have exactly 60 seconds left. This is tragic. 60 seconds, but I'll be asking you back. $64,000 question. You've got 60 seconds to answer it. I think I might guess the answer. Are men more likely to be psychotic than women?
Men are more likely to get diagnosed, but there is a theory that many of the women who get diagnosed as borderline might actually be psychopathic, but we tend to look at women if they display psychopathic traits and tend to think, no, she can't be a psychopath. There must be something else. It's just like when a woman commits mass murder or something. It's like, well, she must have had a hormonal imbalance, whereas a guy is ready to string him up. But I think actually, at least if we go by the literature, males are about 3% of the population psychopath, and women are about 1%. That's still 1 in 100.
It's still 1 in 100. Michael, I tell you what, it's been absolutely fascinating. I mean that. It's been terrific. It's something we'll have to do again soon. Michael's website is michaelcross.net. I'll tweet that out there, and I'll tweet out the address for Michael's Twitter as well. Links on there for the Freedom from Conscience series of books, which, as I've said, have been independently, terrifically reviewed. I'm definitely going to read them. There's no doubt about that after this. And I'll also put out links, Michael, to you on YouTube as well, and people can find out on your website where to listen to the Unlock the Door radio show. It was an absolute pleasure to listen to that, my friend. Incredibly interesting.
Hey,
thanks for coming on, and please come back soon.
Oh, I will, and thanks for having me on, Richie. Keep up the good work. Question authority. Question the dominant paradigm in the society, and see if it really makes sense. Anyway, well, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you'll tune in next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Take care now.
Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.